The old train station clock showed 11:47 p.m. when Jake Martinez stepped onto the empty platform. His expensive boots clicked against the concrete as he pulled his black cowboy hat lower over his eyes. The December wind cut through his leather jacket, but he barely noticed. At 32, Jake had built a cattle empire worth millions, yet tonight he felt emptier than the deserted station around him. He had just closed the biggest deal of his career in Chicago, selling prime beef to 5 major restaurant chains. The briefcase in his hand contained contracts worth $8 million. His phone buzzed constantly with congratulations from business partners, but Jake ignored it. Success felt hollow when you had nobody to share it with. The waiting room was nearly empty except for a few travelers sleeping on benches. Jake walked toward the coffee machine, hoping for something warm before his delayed train arrived. That's when he saw her. A woman in pale blue scrubs sat alone in the corner, her head resting against the cold wall. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and dark circles shadowed her tired eyes. She looked completely exhausted, like she had been working for days without rest. Her uniform suggested she was a nurse, probably heading home after a long shift. Something about her defeated posture made Jake's chest tighten. He had seen that same look in his own mirror too many times, the weight of carrying too much alone. Jake bought 2 cups of coffee and approached her carefully. "Excuse me, miss. You look like you could use this." He held out one of the steaming cups.
"Hey!"
His voice gentle despite his usual commanding tone. The woman looked up with startled green eyes. For a moment she seemed ready to refuse, but then her shoulders sagged. "Thank you," she whispered, accepting the coffee with shaking hands. Her fingers were ice cold when they briefly touched his. "I'm Jake," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Mind if I sit? This place feels pretty." Lonely at midnight, she hesitated before answering. "Sarah." Her voice was barely audible, like she hadn't spoken to another person in hours. "Sarah Collins." Jake noticed she didn't smile or make eye contact. Everything about her body language screamed that she wanted to be left alone, but something kept him from walking away. Maybe it was the tear tracks on her cheeks, or the way she held herself like she was trying not to fall apart. "Long day, eh?" he asked softly, sipping his coffee. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. 72 hours straight in the emergency room. "We lost 3 patients today." Her voice cracked slightly. "Sometimes I wonder why I became a nurse. All this studying, all this debt, and for what? To watch people die?" Jake felt a stab of recognition. He remembered feeling the same way when he started his ranch, working 18-hour days just to keep the bank from taking his family's land. The loneliness of carrying enormous responsibility was something he understood deeply. "Where are you headed?" he asked.
"Out home to Montana."
"My mom's been sick, and I finally got time off to see her." Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm cup like it was a lifeline. "The hospital where I work in Denver has been understaffed for months. We're all running on empty." Jake's heart did something strange when she mentioned Montana. His ranch was just outside Billings, sprawling across thousands of acres of the most beautiful land in the state. Had been heading back there himself, though the big house waiting for him felt more like a museum than a home. "I'm from Montana too," he said quietly. "Born and raised on a cattle ranch outside Billings." For the first time, Sarah looked directly at him. Her green eyes studied his face with new interest. "You don't look like a rancher," she said, taking in his expensive clothes and the gold watch on his wrist. Jake chuckled. "What do I look like then? Like someone who's never had to worry about paying bills?" Sarah said bluntly, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. I'm just tired and stressed about money and everything else." "Don't apologize. You're probably right." Jake leaned back in his chair, studying this woman who seemed to see right through his wealth to something deeper. "Money doesn't solve every problem, though. Trust me on that." Sarah snorted softly. "Easy to say when you have it. You know what it's like to choose between paying rent and buying groceries? To work yourself to death just to stay afloat while watching rich people complain about problems that money could fix in 5 minutes?" Her words hit harder than Jake expected. He had grown up poor, watching his father struggle to keep their small ranch running. But that was a long time ago, and somewhere along the way he had forgotten what that desperation felt like. "You're right," he said simply. I haven't worried about money in years. But I remember what it was like before. Something in his tone made Sarah look at him more carefully. What do you mean? My father owned 40 acres and 12 head of cattle when I was growing up. We ate beans and rice most nights, and I wore the same pair of boots for 3 years because we couldn't afford new ones. Jake's voice grew distant with memory. I swore I'd never be poor again, and I kept that promise. Maybe too well. Sarah's expression softened slightly. What changed? Hard work, smart investments, and probably more luck than I deserved. Jake shrugged. Now, I own the biggest ranch in 3 counties, but some days I miss those simple times when our biggest worry was whether the cattle would survive winter. The train station announcement crackled overhead, calling for boarding on the Chicago 2 Billings route. Both Jake and Sarah looked toward the platform where their train was pulling in. That's us, Jake said, standing and offering his hand to help Sarah up. She looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment before taking it. Her fingers were still cold, but something had shifted in her expression. The wall she had built around herself seemed to crack just slightly as they walked toward the train together. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this chance meeting was the beginning of something important. Sarah Collins was unlike any woman he had ever met, and for the first time in years, he found himself genuinely curious about another person's story. The train car was nearly empty, with only a handful of passengers scattered across the worn seats. Jake followed Sarah down the narrow aisle, noticing how she favored her right foot slightly, probably from standing for 3 straight days. When she stopped at an empty row, he made a quick decision. Would you mind if I sat nearby? He asked. I'm not great with long train rides alone. Sarah looked surprised but nodded toward the seat across the aisle. As they settled in, Jake noticed her pulling out a thin blanket that had seen better days. The train's heating system was struggling against the winter cold, and she wrapped the blanket tightly around her shoulders. Without thinking, Jake stood and retrieved his own jacket from the overhead compartment. It was made of genuine leather, probably worth more than Sarah made in a month. He held it out to her. I can't take that, Sarah said immediately, shaking her head. It looks expensive. It's just a jacket, Jake said gently, and you're shivering. About you screams money, Sarah replied, but there was less hostility in her voice than before. That watch, those boots, the way you carry yourself. I bet you've never had to check your bank balance before buying groceries. Jake sat back down, keeping the jacket on his lap. You're not wrong. But that doesn't mean I can't share a coat with someone who's cold. Sarah studied his face in the dim train lighting. Why are you being nice to me? Which people don't usually notice nurses having bad days at train stations. The question caught Jake off guard. Why was he helping her? He had walked past countless people in need over the years, always too focused on his next deal or business meeting to stop. Something about Sarah's exhausted honesty had broken through his usual barriers. Maybe because you remind me of my sister, he said quietly. She was a teacher, worked herself to death, trying to help kids in poor neighborhoods. Always putting everyone else first, never taking care of herself? Was? Sarah asked softly. Car accident 3 years ago. She was driving home after staying late to help students with their homework. Jake's voice grew tight. She died because she was too tired to react fast enough when another driver ran a red light. Sarah's expression completely changed. The defensive wall in her eyes crumbled, replaced by genuine sympathy. I'm so sorry, Jake. That's terrible. She was the only family I had left, Jake continued, surprised by how easy it was to tell Sarah things he never talked about. After she died, I threw myself into work even harder, built my business bigger and bigger, thinking success would fill the hole she left behind. Did it work? Sarah asked quietly. Jake let out a hollow laugh. What do you think? I'm sitting alone on a train at midnight, talking to a stranger because I can't remember the last time I had a real conversation with another human being. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. Then, to Jake's surprise, she reached across the aisle and took his jacket. Thank you, she said simply. Wrapping it around her shoulders, the leather jacket dwarfed her small frame, but she immediately looked warmer. Jake felt an unexpected surge of satisfaction, seeing her more comfortable. Tell me about your mom, he said. wanting to shift the conversation away from his own pain. You said she's sick? Sarah's face clouded over. Cancer, stage 3. Shh. Been fighting it for 8 months, but the treatments are expensive, and she doesn't have good insurance. Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I've been sending her most of my paychecks, but it's not enough. The doctors say she needs a specialist in Seattle, but we can't afford it. Jake felt his chest tighten. Here was Sarah, working herself to exhaustion for 72 hours straight, all to help pay for her mother's medical bills. No wonder she looked so defeated. How much does she need? He asked without thinking. Sarah's eyes snapped to his face. $200,000 for the treatment program, Sarah said bitterly. Might as well be $2 million for all the difference it makes. I've already taken out every loan I can qualify for, and I'm drowning in student debt from nursing school. Jake was quiet, processing this information. $200,000 was nothing to him, less than he spent on a single weekend buying cattle. But for Sarah, it represented an impossible mountain of debt and desperation. What about other family? Can anyone help? He asked. It's just me and her. My dad left when I was 12, and I don't have brothers or sisters. Sarah pulled his jacket tighter around herself. Sometimes I feel like I'm trying to hold back the ocean with my bare hands. The train rocked gently as it picked up speed, carrying them through the dark countryside. Jake found himself studying Sarah's profile in the window reflection. Even exhausted and worried, she had a quiet strength that impressed him. She was fighting impossible odds with dignity and determination. Why nursing? He asked. With your intelligence, you could have chosen something that pays better. Sarah smiled for the first time since he'd met her. My mom was a nurse. She worked at the county hospital for 30 years, taking care of people who couldn't afford fancy medical care. She taught me that helping people was more important than making money. Her smile faded. Ironic, isn't it? Now I need money to help the person who taught me money wasn't important. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She is. Even now, going through chemo, she worries more about other people than herself. Last week she was trying to convince me to quit my job and go back to school for something that pays better. Sarah shook her head. She doesn't understand that I can't abandon her now. Jake felt something shift inside his chest as he listened to Sarah talk about her mother. The love and devotion in her voice reminded him of how his sister used to talk about her students. There was something purer about people who dedicated their lives to helping others, something he had lost somewhere along his path to wealth. The train doesn't arrive in Billings until tomorrow afternoon, Jake said. Will you have time to spend with her? 3 days. That's all the time off I could get. Sarah's voice was heavy with guilt. 3 days to make up for months of only being able to call her on the phone between shifts. That's not your fault, Jake said firmly. You're doing everything you can. Sarah looked at him with surprise. You don't even know me. How can you be so sure? 'Cause I can see it in everything. About you, Jake replied honestly. The way you've worked yourself to exhaustion. The way you talk about your mother. Even the way you initially didn't trust my help because you're not used to people being kind without wanting something in return. Tears gathered in Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them back quickly. I can't afford to fall apart, she whispered. She needs me to be strong. Everyone needs to fall apart sometimes, Jake said gently. Even the strongest people. As the train continued through the night, carrying them both toward Montana and whatever waited there, Jake realized something important was happening. For the first time in 3 years, he cared about someone else's problems more than his own business concerns. Sarah woke up to sunlight streaming through the train windows and the gentle swaying motion of the rails beneath them. For a moment, she was disoriented, wrapped in an expensive leather jacket that smelled like cologne and saddle soap. Then she remembered the cowboy from the station, and her eyes darted across the aisle to find Jake watching the Montana landscape roll past. Good morning, he said softly, turning to smile at her. Sleep well? Sarah sat up, suddenly self-conscious. She had slept harder than she had in weeks, despite being on a train. Something about Jake's presence had made her feel safe enough to truly rest for the first time in months. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to sleep so long, she said, starting to take off his jacket. Keep it, Jake said. You look warmer. Sarah noticed he was wearing just a thin button-down shirt, and guilt washed over her. Aren't you cold? I'm fine. Cowboys are used to rough weather. He gestured toward the window. Look outside. We're almost home. Sarah turned to see the familiar rolling hills and wide open spaces of Montana. After months in the concrete jungle of Denver, the sight of endless sky and grassland made her heart ache with homesickness. Somewhere out there, her mother was waiting in the small house where Sarah had grown up. It's beautiful, Jake said quietly. I forgot how much I missed it. How long have you been away? 6 months. I've been traveling constantly, setting up deals and expanding the business. Sometimes I think I spend more time in airports and hotels than on my own land. Sarah studied his profile as he watched the landscape. There was something lonely about the way he said it, like success had become a prison instead of a reward. Do you ever think about slowing down? She asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Every day, but I don't know how to stop. When you build something from nothing, you're always afraid it might disappear if you're not watching it constantly. That sounds exhausting. It is. He turned to look at her directly. What about you? Do you ever think about leaving nursing? Sarah considered the question. Sometimes, especially after days like yesterday when nothing goes right and people die despite everything we do. She paused, wrapping his jacket tighter around herself. But then I remember why I started. Someone needs to take care of people who can't take care of themselves. Like your mother. Like my mother, Sarah agreed softly. The train conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to Billings. Sarah felt her stomach clench with anxiety. 3 days wasn't nearly enough time to spend with her mother, especially when she didn't know if there would be a next visit. Sarah, Jake said carefully, can I ask you something personal? She nodded. The wariness crept back into her expression. What would it mean to your mother if you could afford that treatment? In Seattle? Sarah's eyes filled with tears immediately. It would save her life. The doctors here have done everything they can, but this specialist has a new treatment protocol that could put her cancer into remission. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But it's impossible. I've already borrowed against my nursing license and maxed out every credit card I could get. Jake was quiet, but Sarah could see him thinking hard about something. What if it wasn't impossible? He asked quietly. What do you mean? Jake took a deep breath, like he was about to jump off a cliff. What if someone wanted to help, not as charity, but as an investment in something worthwhile? Sarah stared at him, confusion clear on her face. I don't understand. I mean, what if someone had the money to pay for your mother's treatment, and they believed it was the right thing to do? The blood drained from Sarah's face. Jake, no. Can't let you do something like that. I barely know you. You know enough, Jake said firmly. You know I have more money than I need, and you know your mother deserves a chance to live. But why? Sarah's voice was almost a whisper. Why would you help us? Jake looked out the window again, gathering his thoughts. Because yesterday you reminded me what it feels like to care about someone else's problems. I've spent 3 years building walls around myself, focusing only on profit margins and business deals. Meeting you made me remember what actually matters. I can't accept that kind of help from a stranger, Sarah said, but Jake could hear the longing in her voice. Then, don't think of me as a stranger. Think of me as someone who understands what it's like to lose the most important person in your life, and who doesn't want you to go through that if there's another choice. Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now. Hey, Jake, that's $200,000. I could never pay you back. I'm not asking you to pay me back with money, Jake said quietly. Then what? Jake turned to face her fully, his expression serious but kind. Let me get to know you. Let me understand what makes someone dedicate their life to taking care of others instead of chasing wealth. Maybe you can teach me something about what actually makes life worth living. Sarah stared at him in shock. You want to pay for my mother's medical treatment so you can learn how to be a better person? I want to pay for your mother's medical treatment because it's the right thing to do, Jake corrected gently. And yes, I hope spending time around you might help me remember who I used to be before money became the only thing I cared about. The train was slowing now, approaching the Billings station. Sarah could see the platform ahead, and she knew her time to make this impossible decision was running out. My mother would never accept help from a stranger, she said weakly. Then, we'll have to make sure I'm not a stranger anymore, Jake replied with a small smile. Sarah looked into his eyes, searching for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke or manipulation. But all she saw was sincerity and a deep sadness that matched her own. Why do I feel like accepting your help would change everything? She whispered. Because it would, Jake said honestly. For both of us. The train came to a complete stop with a gentle jolt. Around them, the few other passengers were gathering their belongings and preparing to exit. Sarah sat frozen, still wearing Jake's leather jacket, trying to process what had just happened. I need to think about this, she said. Jake stood and retrieved his small travel bag from overhead. Can I at least give you my phone number, in case you want to talk more about it? Cowboy might actually be the answer to prayers she had been too tired to hope would be answered. Sarah, Jake said as they prepared to leave the train, whatever you decide, I'm glad we met. So am I, she whispered, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Sarah's childhood home looked smaller than she remembered as she stood on the front porch. Jake's leather jacket still wrapped around her shoulders. The white paint was peeling, and the wooden steps creaked under her weight. She could see her mother's silhouette in the kitchen, moving slowly but stubbornly maintaining her independence despite the chemotherapy. Sarah. Margaret Collins opened the door before her daughter could knock, pulling her into a gentle hug that felt frailer than it should. At 58, Margaret had always been a force of nature, but cancer had stolen 20 pounds and much of her energy. Hi, Mom, Sarah whispered, breathing in the familiar scent of her. Mother's lavender soap mixed with the medicinal smell that seemed to cling to everything now. You look exhausted, sweetheart. Are they working you too hard at that? Hospital. Margaret stepped back to study her daughter's face, immediately noticing the expensive jacket. And whose coat is this? It's beautiful, Sarah hesitated, Jake's offer still echoing in her mind. 24 hours ago, her biggest worry had been affording her mother's current medications. Now, a stranger was offering to pay for experimental treatment that could save Margaret's life, and Sarah didn't know how to process any of it. I met someone on the train, she said carefully. A rancher from here in Montana. He let me borrow it because the train was cold. Margaret's eyebrows rose with interest. A rancher? Is he handsome? Mom, Sarah protested, but she felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm just asking. You never mentioned meeting anyone, and I worry about you being alone in Denver with no one to take care of you. Sarah followed her mother into the small kitchen, noting how Margaret gripped the counter for support as she walked. The sight made her chest tight with worry and guilt. How could she consider accepting help from a virtual stranger, even if that help could save her mother's life? How are you feeling? Sarah asked, changing the subject. Really feeling not. What do you tell the doctors? Margaret sank into her favorite chair at the kitchen table, the same one where she used to help Sarah with homework 20 years ago. Tired. The new chemo protocol is harder than the last one. But Dr. Peterson says it's our best option with the resources we have. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at it and saw a text from Jake. Hope your visit is going well. No pressure about anything we discussed. Just wanted you to know I'm thinking of you both. The kindness in his message made her throat tight. She had spent so many months fighting alone that having someone simply acknowledge her struggle felt overwhelming. Who's texting you? Margaret asked with a knowing smile. The rancher from the train, Sarah admitted. Ah, and what does this mysterious cowboy do for a living? Sarah realized she had no idea how to explain Jake Martinez to her practical, no-nonsense mother. How do you tell someone that a millionaire cattle rancher wants to pay for their cancer treatment after meeting their daughter at a train station? Owns a large ranch outside town. Cattle, I think. Must be doing well if he can afford jackets like that one, Margaret observed. Is he nice? Sarah thought about Jake's gentle manner, the way he had listened without judgment, and his willingness to help someone he barely knew. Very nice. Almost too nice to believe. Margaret studied her daughter's expression with the sharp eye of someone who had spent 30 years reading people's faces in hospital corridors. Sarah, what aren't you telling me? Before Sarah could answer, her phone rang. Jake's name appeared on the screen and her heart did something complicated. Answer it, Margaret said firmly. I want to meet this mysterious cowboy, even if it's just over the phone. Sarah's hands shook as she accepted the call. Hello, Sarah? I hope I'm not interrupting. I just wanted to check on you and see how your mother is doing. The genuine concern in Jake's voice made Margaret's eyebrows rise. With approval, she gestured for Sarah to put the call on speaker. Actually, my mom would like to say hello, Sarah said nervously, if that's okay. I'd be honored, Jake replied immediately. Sarah switched to speakerphone, and Margaret leaned forward with interest. Mr. Martinez, this is Margaret Collins. Thank you for taking care of my daughter on the train. She tells me you were very kind to her. Please call me Jake, Mrs. Collins, and your daughter was the one who helped me. I was having a pretty lonely night until I met her. Margaret smiled at Sarah, clearly charmed by Jake's manners. She has that effect on people. She's been taking care of everyone around her since she was old enough to reach the medicine cabinet. I can see that, Jake said warmly. Mrs. Collins, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how are you feeling? Sarah mentioned you've been fighting cancer, and I wanted you to know you're both in my thoughts. Sarah watched her mother's expression soften. Margaret had always been a good judge of character, and something in Jake's voice was winning her over. That's very sweet of you, Jake. I'm doing as well as can be expected. The doctors here are wonderful, though I sometimes wonder if there might be better options elsewhere. Sarah's heart stopped. Her mother was opening the door to exactly the conversation Sarah had been dreading. Actually, Mrs. Collins, that's something I wanted to discuss with both of you, Jake said carefully. Sarah, did you have a chance to think about what we talked about on the train? Margaret looked at her daughter with sharp curiosity. Did you two talk about? Sarah felt trapped between her mother's expectant gaze and Jake's voice coming through the phone. Jake, maybe we should discuss this later. Sarah Collins, Margaret said in the tone that had gotten Sarah to confess too. Every childhood misdeed. What is going on? Jake's voice came through the speaker, gentle but clear. Mrs. Collins, I understand there's a specialist in Seattle who might be able to help you with a new treatment protocol. Margaret's face went still. Yes, but we can't afford it. The cost is astronomical. What if cost wasn't an issue? Jake asked quietly. The kitchen fell completely silent. Margaret stared at the phone, then at Sarah, then back at the phone. I'm sorry, what did you say? I said, what if cost wasn't an issue? What if someone wanted to help make sure you got the treatment you need? Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. Jake, I appreciate the thought, but we can't accept charity from someone we just met. It's not charity, Mrs. Collins. It's an investment in something I believe in. What could you possibly believe in enough to spend that kind of money on strangers? Jake was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. I believe in people who dedicate their lives to helping others. I believe in daughters who work themselves to exhaustion to take care of their mothers. And I believe that sometimes good people deserve good things to happen to them. Margaret wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. Jake, that's incredibly generous, but it's too much. We couldn't possibly accept. Mrs. Collins, can I ask you something? If the situation were reversed, if you had the money and you met someone like Sarah who was desperate to save someone they loved, what would you do? Margaret looked at her daughter, seeing the hope and fear warring in Sarah's eyes. I would help them, she whispered. Then let me be the person you would be if you could, she said simply. Sarah watched her mother struggle with pride and desperation, love and practicality. Finally, Margaret spoke again. Jake, why don't you come to dinner tomorrow night? If we're going to discuss something this important, I think we should meet face to face. I would be honored, Jake replied immediately. After they hung up, mother and daughter sat in silence for several minutes. Sarah, Margaret finally said, I think your cowboy might be an angel in disguise. Or he might be too good to be true, Sarah replied, voicing her deepest fear. Only one way to find out, Margaret said with a smile that looked more like her old self than Sarah had seen in months. Jake stood on the Collins family porch at exactly 6 o'clock, holding a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked from his own ranch and a bottle of wine that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. He had changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on dark jeans, a white button-down shirt, and his best boots, expensive but not flashy. His hands were shaking slightly as he knocked on the door. He had negotiated million-dollar deals with corporate executives and foreign investors. But the thought of disappointing Sarah and her mother terrified him more than any business meeting ever had. Sarah opened the door, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. She was wearing a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, and her blonde hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. Without the exhaustion and worry lines that had marked her face on the train, she was absolutely beautiful. "You look wonderful," he said softly, offering her the flowers. "Thank you," Sarah replied, accepting the bouquet with a shy smile. "These are gorgeous. Did you really pick them yourself? From the fields behind my house this morning?" "I thought your mother might prefer them to something from a florist." Sarah's expression warmed. "She will love them." That's exactly the kind of thoughtful gesture that wins her over. Jake followed Sarah into the small house, immediately struck by how different it felt from his own sprawling ranch home. Held family photos, handmade quilts draped over worn furniture, and the lingering scent of something delicious cooking in the kitchen. It felt like a real home filled with love and memories. Margaret emerged from the kitchen wearing her best dress and a determined smile. Jake could see the family resemblance immediately. The same green eyes, same stubborn set to their chins, and the same graceful way of moving despite obvious fatigue. "You must be Jake," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for the flowers. Sarah says you picked them yourself." "Yes, ma'am. I've about 300 acres of wildflower meadows. I thought you might appreciate something that grew naturally in Montana soil." Margaret's smile became genuine. A man who appreciates wildflowers over roses is someone worth knowing. "Come in. Dinner is almost ready." The dining room table was set with Margaret's good china plates that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother and only came out for special occasions. Jake realized this dinner meant as much to them as it did to him, and the weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders. "I hope you don't mind pot roast," Margaret said as they sat down. "Sarah's favorite, and I wanted tonight to be special." "It smells incredible," Jake replied honestly. "I haven't had a home-cooked meal in months. Usually I just grab something between meetings or eat whatever my housekeeper leaves in the refrigerator." Sarah served the food while Margaret studied. Jake, with the sharp eyes of a mother, protecting her daughter. "Tell me about your ranch, Jake." "Sarah says it's quite large. 15,000 acres, mostly cattle grazing land. We run about 2,000 head of premium beef cattle, and I've been expanding into contracts with major restaurant chains." Jake paused, realizing how cold that sounded. "But honestly, the part I love most is just riding out across the land. In the early morning, when everything is quiet and the mountains are catching the first sunlight." "That sounds peaceful," Margaret said. "Do you live there alone?" Sarah shot her mother a warning look, but Jake answered easily. "Yes, ma'am. Just me and my foreman's family who live in a house about a mile away. Probably too much space for one person, but I grew up on that land and I can't imagine living anywhere else." "And your family?" Margaret asked gently. Jake's expression grew sad. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 25. My sister Alina was killed 3 years ago. She was the last family I had left." "I'm so sorry," Margaret said, reaching across the table to pat his hand. "That must be incredibly difficult." "It is. Alina was a teacher, always putting everyone else first, just like Sarah. She would have loved meeting both of you." Jake looked at Sarah, whose eyes had softened with understanding. "Losing her made me realize how empty my life had become. I threw myself into building the business, but success doesn't keep you warm at night or give you someone to share good news with." Margaret and Sarah exchanged a meaningful look. They both understood loss and loneliness better than most people. "That why you want to help us?" Sarah asked quietly. "Because we remind you of your sister?" Jake considered the question carefully. "Partly, but also because meeting you made me remember what it feels like to care about something bigger than profit. Margins. I've spent 3 years building walls around my heart, and somehow you managed to knock them down in one train ride." Margaret smiled knowingly. "Sarah has that effect on people. Even as a little girl, she was always bringing home stray animals and befriending the lonely kids at school." "Mom," Sarah protested, but she was smiling. "It's true. You've been taking care of everyone around you since you were old enough to reach the medicine cabinet. Margaret turned back to Jake. Which brings us to why you're really here. The mood at the table grew serious. Jake set down his fork and looked directly at Margaret. Mrs. Collins, I want to pay for your treatment in Seattle because I believe it's the right thing to do. I have more money than I could spend in 5 lifetimes, and you and Sarah are fighting for something truly important. Jake, what you're offering is incredibly generous, but it's also life-changing money, Margaret said carefully. What do you expect in return? Nothing except the chance to get to know both of you better. I've been lonely for a long time, and meeting Sarah reminded me what it feels like to connect with someone who has a good heart. Sarah looked uncomfortable. Jake, I don't want you to think I'm using you for your money. I barely know you. I barely know you, Jake replied, but I know enough. I know you work yourself to exhaustion to help people who can't help themselves. I know you've sacrificed everything to take care of your mother. And I know that in one night you made me feel more human than I have in 3 years. Margaret studied Jake's face for a long moment. Da-da-da-da-da-da. What happens if the treatment doesn't work? What if we take your money and I die anyway? Jake's voice was firm. Then at least we'll know we tried everything possible. You'll have had the chance to fight this disease with the best weapons available, instead of settling for what you can afford. And if it does work? Margaret asked. Then hopefully you'll both let me be part of your lives going forward. I'd like to have people to call family again. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Jake, you can't just buy yourself a family. I'm not trying to buy anything, Jake said gently. I'm trying to invest in people I care about. There's a difference. Margaret reached across the table and took both Sarah's and Jake's hands in hers. Jake, I have one more question for you. Yes, ma'am? If Sarah asked you to walk away right now, if she decided this was too complicated or moved too fast, would you respect her decision? Jake looked at Sarah, his expression completely sincere. Absolutely. I would arrange for the payment to the Seattle clinic to be made anonymously, and you would never hear from me again if that's what Sarah wanted. Sarah stared at him in shock. You would still pay for the treatment even if I never wanted to see you again? Yes, because your mother deserves a chance to live, regardless of what happens between us. Margaret smiled, and for the first time since her diagnosis, it reached her eyes completely. Jake Martinez, I think you might be exactly what my daughter needs, Mom, Sarah whispered, but there was no protest in her voice. Sarah, sweetheart, sometimes the universe sends us exactly what we need at exactly the right moment. Don't let pride or fear make you turn away from something that could be wonderful. Jake looked at Sarah, hope and vulnerability clear in his expression. Not asking you to make any promises or commitments. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that not all wealthy cowboys are heartless businessmen. Sarah laughed through her tears. Are there a lot of wealthy cowboys running around, rescuing nurses at train stations? Just this one, Jake replied with a grin that transformed his entire face. Margaret squeezed both their hands, and I guess we better give him a chance to prove himself. As they finished dinner, talking and laughing like old friends, none of them could have predicted that this conversation would be the beginning of a story that would eventually capture the attention of the entire world. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of Jake's ranch house. Morning sunlight streaming through the large windows as she prepared coffee for the news crew setting up in the living room. Margaret sat at the kitchen island, her hair growing back in soft silver curls after completing her successful treatment in Seattle. The cancer was in complete remission, and she looked healthier than she had in over a year. Are you nervous about the interview? Margaret asked, watching her daughter fidget with the coffee cups. Terrified, Sarah admitted. When Jake first suggested sharing our story, I never imagined it would get this much attention. The story had started small, a local newspaper piece, about a wealthy rancher who paid for a stranger's cancer treatment. But something about their unlikely meeting resonated with people hungry for good news. The story spread to regional papers, then national news, and finally international media outlets fascinated by the modern fairy tale of the cowboy and the nurse. Where is Jake? Margaret asked, outside talking to the film crew. He's even more nervous than I am. Sarah smiled, thinking about how much her life had changed since that night at the train station. He keeps saying he never intended to become the poster child for wealthy people doing good deeds. Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking handsome but uncomfortable in his best button-down shirt and jeans. The producer says they're almost ready. You sure you want to do this? We can still call it off. Sarah walked over to him, straightening his collar in a gesture that had become natural over the past months. We agreed to do this interview because our story might inspire other people to help each other. It's worth being a little uncomfortable. More than a little, Jake muttered, but he was smiling as he looked down at her. Margaret, are you ready? To be famous? At my age, I'll take fame over the alternative, Margaret replied with a laugh. Besides, someone needs to make sure you two don't get too sentimental and start crying on national television. The producer, an energetic woman named Lisa, appeared in the kitchen. We're ready for you. Remember, just be natural and tell your story the way you lived it. People want to hear authenticity, not perfection. They settled into the living room Jake had reluctantly allowed to be transformed into a television set. The reporter, Tom Chen, from the national morning show, had flown in from New York specifically for this interview. He was known for his warm, conversational style that put nervous subjects at ease. Good morning, Tom said as the cameras began rolling. I'm here in Montana with Jake Martinez, Sarah Collins, and Margaret Collins to talk about a story that has captured hearts around the world. Jake, let's start with you. 6 months ago, you were a successful businessman focused entirely on expanding your cattle empire. What changed? Jake looked at Sarah, drawing strength from her encouraging smile. I met Sarah at a train station in Chicago. She was the most exhausted, worried person I'd ever seen, but also the most determined. In one conversation, she reminded me that there are things more important than money. Sarah, what was your first impression of Jake? Sarah laughed. Honestly, I thought he was too good to be true. Rich, handsome cowboys don't usually offer to pay for strangers' medical bills. I was suspicious of his motives. What convinced? You two accept his help? My mother, Sarah said, glancing at Margaret. He's always been a good judge of character, and she saw something in Jake that I was too scared to trust. Tom turned to Margaret. Margaret, what did you see in Jake that your daughter missed? Margaret smiled. Loneliness. He was a successful, wealthy man who had everything except the things that actually matter. Family, connection, purpose beyond making money. Sarah was exactly what he needed, and he was exactly what we needed. Sometimes the universe has perfect timing, Jake. Critics have suggested this was an expensive publicity stunt, or that you had ulterior motives. How do you respond to that? Jake's expression grew serious. If I wanted publicity, I would have called the media myself instead of trying to keep the story quiet for months. The truth is, helping Margaret wasn't about publicity. It was about trying to become the kind of person my sister Alina would have been proud of. Tell me about Alina. She was a teacher who died in a car accident 3 years ago. She spent her life helping kids who didn't have advantages, never thinking about money or recognition. After she died, I lost sight of what really mattered. Jake's voice grew thick with emotion. Meeting Sarah brought me back to the values Alina tried to teach me. Tom leaned forward. Sarah, how has your relationship with Jake evolved over these 6 months? Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she answered honestly. At first I was grateful, but cautious. I kept waiting for him to ask for something in return, or to show his true colors. Instead, he just kept being kind and patient and genuine. He became my best friend, and then... She looked at Jake with obvious affection. He became much more than that. Are you two engaged? Jake and Sarah exchanged a look that made their feelings obvious even without words. We're taking things slowly, Jake said. We want to make sure we're building something real, not just caught up in the extraordinary circumstances of how we met. But you're living together? Sarah moved to the ranch 3 months ago, Jake confirmed. Her mother needed ongoing care. After the treatment, and it made sense for them both to stay here, this house was too big and empty for one person anyway. Tom turned to Margaret. How do you feel about your daughter's relationship with Jake? I've never seen Sarah happier, Margaret said simply. Jake didn't just save my life. He gave my daughter a chance at the kind of love story I always hoped she would find. He's become the son I never had. Jake, what would you say to other wealthy individuals who might be inspired by your story? Jake considered the question carefully. I would say that money is just a tool. It can't buy happiness or love, but it can be used to create opportunities for those things. If you have more than you need, look around for people who are fighting battles you could help them win. It won't just change their lives, it will change yours too. Sarah, you've returned to nursing, but now work at the local hospital here in Montana. Any regrets about leaving your career in Denver? None, Sarah said firmly. I love being close to my mom and Jake, and the work here is just as meaningful as what I did in Denver. Plus, Jake has been talking about starting a foundation to help families facing medical crises. I might get involved with that project. A foundation? Tom asked Jake. Sarah's idea, actually. We've been contacted by hundreds of families in situations similar to what Margaret faced. We can't help everyone individually, but we might be able to create something sustainable that addresses the broader problem. Tom smiled as he prepared to wrap up the interview. Before we finish, I have to ask Margaret, the doctors in Seattle say your response to treatment has been exceptional. How are you feeling? Margaret's eyes sparkled with joy and mischief. I feel like I have a lot of living left to do, and maybe some grandchildren to spoil someday, if these two ever stop being so careful about taking things slowly. Sarah buried her face in her hands while Jake laughed out loud. Margaret Collins, did you just give us relationship advice on national television? Someone has to. You're both too polite to make the first move toward something permanent. Tom grinned at the camera. And there you have it, a love story that began with a chance meeting at a train station and proves that sometimes the best things in life happen when we're brave enough to help a stranger. Thank you all for sharing your story. As the crew packed up their equipment, Jake pulled Sarah aside. Your mother's right, you know. We've been too careful. What do you mean? Sarah asked, though her heart was already racing. Jake dropped to one knee right there in his living room, pulling out a ring box he had been carrying for weeks. Sarah Collins, you saved my life just as much as I helped save your mother's. You marry me? Through the kitchen doorway, they could hear Margaret cheering. The camera crew stopped packing to watch, and Lisa the producer whispered urgently to her cameraman to keep filming. Yes, Sarah whispered, then louder. Yes, of course yes. As Jake slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her, Margaret appeared with champagne she had apparently been hiding in the refrigerator. I knew this was going to happen today, she announced. A mother knows these things. Tom Chen looked at his producer with delight. Please tell me we got that on camera. Every second, Lisa confirmed. And that's how the story of the wealthy cowboy who found a cold nurse at a train station became the proposal that broke the internet. Proving that sometimes real life creates better fairy tales than fiction ever. Could the world watch their wedding 6 months later? But by then, Jake and Sarah had learned the most important lesson of all. The best stories aren't about the extraordinary circumstances that bring people together, but about the ordinary. Moments of love, kindness, and commitment that happen every day after the cameras stop rolling.